From claiming the whole genre's become lazy to the way his critical approach will shape the future of the DCU, here's how James Gunn really feels about superhero movies. For starters, he thinks the genre's gotten pretty lazy these past few years. You have to admit, superhero movies are kinda starting to blend into each other. Just take a look at MCU's recent output and you'll get what I mean. In Gunn's view, studios typically greenlit films simply because they've got a superhero in the lead role, and they don't put much effort into appreciating what makes the character special. You've got to understand, James isn't just in it for the money. He's been a lifelong fan of superhero comics because they were his only escape during his troubled childhood. And I have to say, the guy had a rough time growing up. In his own words, he was a bit of an oddball child, so it was pretty hard for him to make friends. His parents even sent him to a psychiatrist when he was just 11 years old because they felt like something might be wrong with him. In the end, Gunn found solace in the fantastical world of comic books, and he didn't discriminate either. He loved Marvel and DC equally, which explains how he's done so well making movies on both sides of the fence. What's more, comic books helped him connect with his dad for the first time, because, you see, Gunn's father wasn't much of a nerd. He was the kind of guy that preferred watching baseball in his free time. But when James's psychiatrist told him to take more of an interest in his son's passions, he decided to take him to Comic-Con in Chicago. According to James, that ended up being the best weekend of his life, also mentioning how overjoyed he was when he saw his dad reading a Superman comic. Clearly, superheroes mean a lot to James, and he's also aware of how badly they've been handled on screen. He didn't go into specifics, but I'd imagine train wrecks like Superman 4, the Ben Affleck Daredevil movie, and Batman and Robin rubbed him the wrong way. Gunn's always wanted to take care of these characters, so he takes his job very seriously, and he wants to use his power to right past wrongs. Given all of this, I get why he's frustrated by the current state of superhero movies. I mean, this is the guy behind the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy, which is widely considered to have saved the MCU during its weak second phase. Look, the Marvel movies were going through a pretty rough patch before Guardians came out. Thor: The Dark World is arguably the only bad film in the Infinity Saga, and even Phase 2's Avengers movie left a lot to be desired. I guess Iron Man 3 was a decent film, but it didn't reach the same heights as the first two installments. So, apart from The Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy was perhaps the only bright spot in an otherwise lackluster second phase. And that's all because of how committed James Gunn is to the very concept of superheroes. It's safe to say his quirky take on the Guardians had an enormous impact on the rest of the Infinity Saga. Just his offbeat humor was enough to influence how the MCU treated some of its character. Like, remember how bland Thor used to be? After Guardians came out, the MCU immediately started looking for a director that could give him a personality. And sure enough, they found the right fit with Taika Waititi. Now, I'm not saying the director ripped James off, but they definitely have the same sense of humor. Ragnarok breathed new life into arguably the least popular Avenger, with the God of Thunder's grim personality replaced with a bubbly and hilarious himbo vibe. It's not a stretch to say that James Gunn inspired the change, and as if that wasn't enough, Guardians of the Galaxy's cosmic setting was even more significant. One of the MCU's latest projects, Secret Invasion, features the alien race called the Skrull. But if Gunn hadn't taken the story to the stars, it might have been tricky to bring these otherworldly creatures into the fold. In fact, I don't see Endgame working without the first Guardians movie either. Not only were Star-Lord and his gang crucial to the film's plot, but thanks to Volumes 1 and 2, audiences were primed and ready for Tony, Doctor Strange, and Spider-Man's trip to space. Unfortunately, the MCU hasn't been able to keep the momentum going. After the near-perfect Infinity Saga, it kind of feels like they're spinning their wheels, almost like they're making the same movie over and over again with a different superhero. A lot of this genericism comes from those repetitive third acts. Like, we've all seen it a million times before. The hero finally meets their enemy in some wild setting. They face off with their visually stunning powers. And ultimately, the bad guy's defeated through some plot device or the other. It was a pretty great way to close off the films at first, but now, It's become an all-too predictable part of the MCU formula. Unsurprisingly, Gunn's pointed to these weak third acts as a prime example of where today's superhero movies go wrong. There's only so many climactic battles you can watch before getting numb to the spectacle, and Gunn feels like the characters and the plot usually don't justify that type of finale. He often feels pretty indifferent about the characters as he enters the third act, and no amount of CGI or explosions can compensate for that. It's not all talk either. Each installment of the Guardians trilogy earned its CGI-fueled final battle by delivering plenty of emotional payoffs. They service the story, close off character arcs, and offer both style and substance. Now, this isn't the only problem James has with superhero flicks. He's also wanted to explore different genres, which might sound weird at first. Like, isn't the superhero film a genre in itself? Not in Gunn's opinion. He sees them as more of a means to an end, allowing for multiple genres to come to the forefront. Considering Gunn's track record for making witty superhero movies, you might think he favors comedy, but that's not exactly true. Gunn loves the gritty just as much as the lighthearted, and he'd like to see filmmakers try for a little more diversity. Nowadays, superhero films are a mishmash of action, comedy, and maybe a bit of sci-fi or fantasy. But Gunn wants more movies that zero in on a specific genre. For example, The Winter Soldier is one of the best MCU movies of all time, because instead of rehashing the same old tropes, it brought a political thriller angle to the table. Over in DC's corner, the Batman mature murder mystery vibe was an enormous success, and you can imagine how much more variation we'd get if studios started thinking out of the box. Gunn wants more superhero movies to have a precise identity, and he's bringing that energy to his new role as the CEO of DC Studios. Getting fired by Disney turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to James. He was worried he'd have to sell his house and leave the business entirely. But instead, he crossed the aisle to the DCEU, and a couple projects later, Warner Brothers knew they'd found the right man to steer the ship. He'd already saved one cinematic universe before, and he could easily do it again with the struggling DCEU. The Suicide Squad and Peacemaker are trademark James Gunn, but true to his word, he's trying to branch the new DCU's projects out into as many genres as possible. Just off the top of my head, Swamp Thing might give us the first superhero film in the horror genre. Granted, Sam Raimi leaned on his horror roots for Multiverse of Madness, but again, it was mostly genre tropes in the same superhero package. Swamp Thing's gonna take things to a whole other level, mostly because the character looks like something out of a H.P. Lovecraft novel. The monstrous superhero's basically just a pulsing mound of plant matter, but despite his terrifying appearance, his main gig is protecting the environment. That's maybe one of the most unique backstories I've ever seen in a superhero story, but for some reason, it's been decades since he appeared in a feature film. Luckily for us, Gunn thrives on revamping lesser-known characters, and he's probably the only person that'd give Swamp Thing a proper horror genre adaptation. All these critiques make one thing pretty clear. James Gunn's high standards will help shape the DCU, so we'll finally get movies that do the characters justice. Frankly, the DCEU was an absolute dumpster fire, and if James hadn't stepped in, I'd have written it off for good. He's saying what every superhero fan's thinking these days. Superhero movies need to change. They need to evolve and grow beyond the MCU model. I'm personally rooting for his success, because the superhero genre won't survive without change. After hearing his thoughts, I'm willing to bet that his DCU will mark the beginning of a new era. So from his opinions helping to chart a new course for DC Studios, to his claims that the genre's gotten lazy, that was how James Gunn really feels about superhero movies.